Welcome to my class on custom GPTs. I am Jules White. I'm a professor in computer science at Vanderbilt University, and I'm the senior advisor to the chancellor on generative AI and enterprise and education. I'm going to talk to you about this fascinating new space of how we can build conversational assistants to help us control computing and to solve real-world problems. But there's a lot of complexity in going and building these new generative AI assistants. When we want to go and build a custom GPT, we're going to have to think about how a user might talk to it and how do we give it strategies to solve different problems and deal with ambiguity in the real world, but also how do we create really interactive, amazing experiences. I'm going to teach you a whole bunch of patterns for building these custom GPTs and doing things that are really powerful to help the user, solve the problem that's in front of them, while also hedging our bets and being careful about risk and thinking carefully about testing things and making sure that we don't produce outputs that can't be trusted or create more problems for the user. It's an absolutely fascinating space of exploration, and I can't wait to embark on this journey with you. To really use generative AI effectively, we have to start thinking about programming it. Now, if you're not a software engineer or a computer scientist, this may seem alien to you, but it's really quite simple, and it's important for actually really getting the potential of generative AI. And I want to show you what I mean by this. So I want you to start thinking about programming generative AI to do something. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at a really simple example. I've gone into ChatGPT and I've said, I'm going to the grocery store. Really simple statement, not a lot of context about what this means, what it's supposed to do, and how does it respond? That's great. Do you need to help with making a shopping list or perhaps some tips to what to buy? You see, I'm just giving it a simple statement. Now, what if when I want it to respond, I want it to respond in a happy, excited, over-the-top way, rather than something sort of really flat? What would I do? Well, I could go into this conversation. I could say, redo your last response and make it really exciting. But there's another way to get there. And it's to start thinking about time, telling it what to do in the future before you've given it the message that you want it to change its response. So this is I could go now and I could say, update your response, make your response really excited and over the top, like that. And now it says, oh wow, that's absolutely fantastic. Heading to the grocery store is like embarking on a thrilling adventure. But the challenge with this is, I had to go after the fact and tell it what I really wanted. I had to go and give it that additional context. And let's say you were trying to build some type of custom GPT for somebody else to use. You don't want them to have to know to go in after the message and say what you want. You want to be able to tell them up front, go do whatever you want, and it will figure out the right way to respond. So let's see how we can do that. Rather than thinking about just saying, here's the message, instead we can start giving it time and programming it. We can say, from now on, and this is really important, we're saying in the future, messages to come, respond to every message with a super excited and happy tone, be way over the top. So what I'm doing is I'm not giving it a message for right now, I'm giving it a message about what to do in the future. And when you start thinking about that, describing what you want done in the future is programming. That is programming how it's going to respond in the future. When you give it a message, or maybe you're creating a custom GPT and somebody else gives it a message, but it's creating that context. So from now on, respond to every message with a super and excited, happy tone, be way over the top. I'm going to the grocery store. And now we get that excited message that we saw before. Wow, that sounds like an epic journey. And so you see, we're programming it to respond differently. Now, what are the types of things we might want to program in? We might want to program in tone, like we have right here. What does it sound like when it responds? Is it really formal? We could have gone in and we could say, from now on, respond in an extremely formal way. That's one thing we could have done. We could have said, be really over the top and excited. We could say, be neutral. And so we can adjust the tone that it uses to respond to the user. What else can we do? Well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to ask it, give me some unique ideas for how to use generative AI that combine all of my roles and what you know about me. Now, it doesn't know anything about me. Doesn't know who I am, doesn't know my name, doesn't know where I live, doesn't know what my job title is. And it gives me a bunch of sort of generic stuff. Some of them actually, I think, randomly hit the nail on the head. Personalized learning and development tools, well, that would be something that's interest to me. Creative content generation, data-driven wellness, not so much of an interest to me. AI-assisted project management, innovative problem-solving sessions, enhanced environmental initiatives, interactive historical learning experiences. All of these are exciting things, but they're not really about me. They're not personalized to me. So what's something else we can do to program it? Well, we can program it with background knowledge. It could be knowledge about who I am and where I live, or it could be knowledge about my business, about my university. It could be knowledge about how I want things done in terms of like, here's background knowledge on process that you should know. And so I can do that. I can give it background knowledge. I can say, from now on, remember the following things and use them to help you respond. My name is Jules White. I'm a professor in computer science at Vanderbilt University. I'm the senior advisor to the Chancellor in Generative AI, Enterprise and Education Solutions. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I teach a large class on prompt engineering on Coursera. So now I've given it background information about me. And now if I go and I say, give me some unique ideas for how to use Gen AI that combine all the roles you know about me, now I get things that are based on where I live, Nashville-themed AI-generated educational content, AI-driven enterprise innovation workshops, and you see it's pulling information it knows about me. I've given it background information. So we can program tone. We can program it with background knowledge that it should base its answers on. Not just the knowledge that it was trained on, but we can actually give it new knowledge that's just baked in. Now, people talk a lot about having to train a new model, but in reality, most of the time you don't even need to train a new model. You just need to tell it, here's the information that you don't know today that you need to know in order to respond or solve the problems that I want you to solve. What else can we do with programming them? Well, I've gone through and I've taken Vanderbilt's webpage and I just copy and pasted. I just highlighted everything on Vanderbilt's webpage here and I have dumped it into ChatGPT. So it's got tons and tons of unformatted information. What does it do with this, right? Well, what it does is it starts summarizing, because that's a common use case that a lot of people use it for. So it starts summarizing all of this stuff, which is great if that's what I wanted, but I wanted something slightly different. I wanted to say, from now on, turn everything I give you into CSV. This is a comma-separated value or tabular data like you could import into a tool like Excel or numbers. And so I want it to, no matter what I dump into it, it gives me structured information out. That's a very different way of behaving than ChatGPT normally does. I'm totally changing its standard behavior and reply to do something much more complex, which is turned into data. I'm basically giving it instructions about what to do and how to respond by default. It says, okay, I understand. And now I go and I dump all that same Vanderbilt information from the web page into it. And now you see what it's doing. It's turning it into data. So it's creating a version of ChatGPT that's customized, that knows no matter what I give you, turn it into structured data that I can do something with. So you're beginning to see that we can program the large language model to do unique and new things that we normally don't think it can do. We normally think, oh, it doesn't know about me. It doesn't know my background, or it won't know the user's background that comes in and starts interacting with it. Because when we start thinking about customizing it for other people, we want it to know who they are. Or if we start thinking about customizing it for other people and we're going to be representing our organization, we may want to customize the tone that it takes and how it communicates with people. If we're a law firm, we might want it to be very formal and very, very careful in what it says. And if we're, a really fun brand, we want it to be over the top and excited about what it's doing. Great job that you're going to the grocery store. But in order to do that, we have to customize that tone. So programming it is all about telling it what's going to happen in the future. We go from being able to just say, I'm going to the grocery store and getting a flat response to this, to going and saying, from now on, which are really powerful words, everything into the future, go and do this differently. And now we get the big over-the-top answers like we have here with emojis and wow. We can program what it knows about you or the user, the background information it has. We can program really complex things like that no matter what you give it, it turns it into data. And suddenly we can build office applications, work applications, all kinds of complex things. These all come from the simple idea that we can program how it responds in the future in the conversation. That's the key to really, really building exciting, customized versions of large language models like ChatGPT. Now, if we have to go in every time we're going to interact with ChatGPT or a large language model and kind of like type all this background sort of programming in, from now on, do this, this, and this, that's kind of a pain. There's also other issues with it. Like if we have a really long context, like we have a really long conversation, it may forget what we told it at the very beginning. So we need some way of giving it these instructions so that every time we start a new conversation, it'll automatically have all of the sort of background programming we want it to have about who you are or the user is, what the tone is, all this type of stuff. Now, how do we do that? Well, we can do that. One way we can do that in ChatGPT is through custom instructions or this menu that says Customize ChatGPT. Now, if there's one thing I've learned from these classes and recording video for them, by the time you see this, the interface for this very well could have changed because it's moving so quickly, but the fundamental concept is the same. So if you're watching this video later and there's not this exact screen, go and look for the place where you can put in custom instructions or something like that, Customize ChatGPT, because that's what I'm doing here. Now, I'm going to build some custom instructions for my 10-year-old. I'm going to say I'm a 10-year-old that lives in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm in the 4th grade. We're learning about geometry in school. I love BMX and mountain biking. And I'm putting that in the custom instructions where it says, what would you like ChatGPT to know about you to provide better responses? Now remember, I did this for myself before, but I'm going to try to build a custom set of instructions for my 10-year-old. How would you like ChatGPT to respond? And I'm going to say, always explain concepts in a fun way that I can understand and weave in my interests. So I want to customize ChatGPT to what he does and what he likes. So I'm going to save this. And now we're going to have a customized version of ChatGPT. So let's go and start a new conversation and see how this changes things. So now we've got a new conversation. I'm going to switch it to GPT-4. And I'm going to say, please explain some fun math concepts. Now let's see if we get something different. Well, notice already it knows who I am and what I'm interested in. Here's your love for BMX bikes and mountain biking, mixing in, imagine math is like a secret trail map that helps us explore and understand the world in some awesome ways. And so we've immediately customize ChatGPT in a totally new way. It's going to respond differently. The magic of pi and circles. And imagine your BMX bike wheel is a perfect circle. Angles and jumps. When you're doing a jump on your BMX or your mountain bike, this is, by the way, something he loves to do and will probably pay attention to, you're creating angles with your bike in the air. Like, it's completely changed how it responds because now we've gone and we've programmed it to have a different default. Now, this is something simple that a lot of people don't take advantage of, but you can go and customize ChatGPT. Now, a lot of people talk about training new models. And there are cases where you probably do want to train new models. But the vast majority of us, the vast majority of businesses and organizations do not need to train new models. They need to customize the model, program it to do what they want and respond in the way they want so that when you go into it, it is already primed and ready to go in the direction you want, as we see here. I didn't need to train a new model in order to have something that now knows about my son, knows about what he's interested in, explains concepts at the right level, and does the right thing. I just went in and started programming the custom GPT, or in this case, I customized the ChatGPT experience for that with additional instructions. Now, there's something unique about what's going on here. One of the things that we're doing is we're doing it in this way through these custom instructions that if the conversation gets long, these instructions will always sort of be emphasized and remembered. And that's a key part of this. If we just went into the conversation, we would have to type all this in for one, and that is a pain, but it's not the major problem. One of the bigger problems is if we had a really long conversation, it might totally forget these background instructions and rules. And part of what we get with this customization option, these custom instructions for ChatGPT, is that behind the scenes, it keeps reminding ChatGPT by inserting them back into the prompt of what we've asked for, how we've wanted it programmed, so it won't forget them. Now, you could do it in a conversation, but it might forget them. But if you do it in this way, they'll always be there and always be present. And that's the difference, is we're essentially customizing it forever, not for the length that it can remember those instructions. And if we did it just based on typing it into a message, at some point it might start forgetting again, and we'd have to go and provide it the information on our ground rules so it remembered what we wanted again. Whereas this is brought back into the conversation over and over and over again. Now, this is a key concept, and I just want to take a moment to explain this. Behind the scenes, when we're working with these tools, these large language models, we can introduce programming or instructions at the right point in time to change their behavior. We can give it new information. We can give it new rules. And we can do that conversationally if we are power users through the interface so that you type in the right things at the right time. But if you want to create some custom experience, like a custom chatbot or a special assistant that's going to help people in a particular part of your organization, what you can do is you can create some customized ChatGPT or large language model experience where the right programming is injected to it, either at the beginning of the conversation, or you might have something, if you're more sophisticated, where at certain points in time, it changes the programming. So as they're going in and doing one task, you have a certain set of instructions guiding that task. And then at a different point in time, you inject a new set of instructions. You reprogram it a different way. So what might this look like? Well, as I'm going through and having my son, and he's interacting with it, I might have a mode that's sort of like exploration mode, figuring out what he's interested in. And then when he gets there, it goes into, and he says, oh, I'm interested in that, it goes into teaching mode. And it has a different sort of set and style of interacting with him to teach him. And then when he gets into the point where it thinks that he knows enough about the topic to begin being assessed or tested on it, it could go into quiz mode and have a different set of rules for how it responds. Now, we could do this all in custom instructions where we tell it how and when to switch out, or we could have more complex ways of doing it, which a lot of people and organizations are doing these days. But the key thing is these instructions behind the scenes that are inserted in can program and change what it knows, how it responds, and in a way that the user cannot change. Now, one of the things that could have happened before is my son could have gone and he could have changed what I had said. He could have said, I am an 18-year-old, and these are the things I'm interested in, and I wouldn't want that guardrail, I wouldn't want that customization, I wouldn't want him to be able to go and change it. I want it to be locked in at his age and sort of how I've told it to respond to him. So what we're also doing is we're putting guardrails in place. If we do it through the conversation, he can always go and override the guardrails by saying, hey, I've grown up. I'm 18 now. You don't realize it, but I grew up. And suddenly it might think he's 18. And so what we're also doing is by putting these instructions in, we can say things like, no matter what, you're going to assume that the user is in the 4th grade, even if they tell you otherwise. And then he can't go and change it. Now, there is a whole cottage industry and research of how do we get around these guardrails as users. But in general, the key thing to know is that these guardrails, these custom instructions that are programming it, are putting in place rules that the user cannot easily change. Now, if you have a sophisticated user who wants to go after them and wants to manipulate them, they probably can at this point. And it'll always be sort of an arms race to try to defend against these changes. But you can put in place rules that are much more difficult for the user to change, or you can actually make it easy and say, this is the default of how I want you to behave. But if the user wants to tell you to do it in other ways, gladly accept their rules. And so you get to kind of choose and decide and put those in place in the background. And in some cases, it may be that you want to put really hard guardrails, and in some places, it may be others. But when you start using this customization function, this custom instructions, you're putting in place rules behind the scenes that the user cannot see. They do not have to type in at the beginning of the conversation in order to make these things happen. And you can also sort of use them as guardrails to limit what can or cannot be done, which can be a very, very powerful use case. One of the things that really helps to understand is how these models incorporate information. Because a lot of people think that you have to train a model on the information that it's going to use to reason. And as we've already seen, we don't have to do that. We can go and give it new information. But I really want to kind of take a moment to really drill into this point a little bit more and talk about an important concept called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. It is a complicated sounding term. Underneath the hood, there is some complexity to it, but at a high level, most people don't need to understand the deep technical details. You just want to understand what it is, how it works, and how it benefits you, particularly when you're trying to build a custom GPT or some other large language model that's customized to a particular information set without being trained from scratch. Most of the time, most organizations do not need to fine-tune or customize a model by retraining it. They need to augment its information that it's used. So I'm going to give you an example of this. So this is a news article from Vanderbilt from March 25th of 2024. And we have announced a new college dedicated to computing, AI, and data science. Now, of course, I just instantly dated this video, but that's okay because I'm also going to show you another important piece. So Vanderbilt just announced this. Now, what is the date that the training cut off for GPT-4, which is what I'm using in this conversation? So I say, when is your training cut off? It's April 2023. Now, what happens if I ask it a question about the Vanderbilt new announcement on the Connected Computing College, which came after in 2024? Well, let's find out. What is the new college that Vanderbilt just announced it is creating? Vanderbilt recently announced it is creating a new College of Connected Computing, which features programs in various computing disciplines. And that's exactly right. So how does it know that? Well, look at this. If you highlight over the end of the conversation, there's these little quotation marks at the very end right after this. After the 1981, there are these quotation marks. And if you highlight that, what does it show? Well, it shows a link to this web page, Vanderbilt to establish a college dedicated to computing, AI, data, and data science. So what's going on here? How does it know that if it wasn't trained on it? Well, what's happening behind the scenes is that when you ask the question, it needs new updated information that it's going and doing a web search or pulling from an updated database of information about the world of what's current. So it's searching for current information. And then it's pulling that current information in and it's putting it into the prompt so that it now can respond to it. It's not retraining the model. The model was not retrained with Vanderbilt's latest press release. No, what's happening is, just like we did when we took the Vanderbilt webpage and we copied and pasted it in and said turn it into data, what's happening is behind the scenes, they are finding updated relevant information from the web, either through a web search that's happening dynamically or through some database of up-to-date information that they're just giving it direct access to pull from. And then they're finding relevant chunks of information and they're putting it into the prompt. You're just not seeing it. And then they're combining that information with your prompt and putting it all into ChatGPT or GPT-4 in this case, and it's responding. Okay, let's break this down and see what's happening. And they're using RAG more than likely to do this. All right, tell me about the new generative AI innovation program that Jules White's team is running at Vanderbilt. This is a question that it cannot answer with current information because that announcement is trapped on my LinkedIn page and it does not have access to it. It probably can't find it. It's probably not high enough visibility for it to have access to it and see it, or it's not in the top search results. So what happens when I ask it this question? And I just put this out there like a week or two ago. It says, The new Generative AI Innovation Program at Vanderbilt, led by Jules White, is part of the university's broader Future of Learning and Generative AI initiative. And then it goes on and it describes the Future of Learning initiative, which we announced in 2023. So it's actually answering the question with old information that is not correct because it doesn't have access to that newer information. So this is a question that it cannot answer correctly. So how do I fix this? If I wanted it to know about my new innovation program, I wanted it to have up-to-date information, I just go and I copy and paste the information in. So I went and copied and pasted a bunch of the information about the program in, and now I say, tell me about the new Generative AI Innovation Program, and it does a much better job of getting it right. But one of the things it's doing is it's still weaving in the information, the other information that it had access to. So what's happening, and I just want to emphasize this, is in order to make it able to answer this question correctly, tell me about the new Generative AI Innovation Program that Jules White's team is running at Vanderbilt, it does not know and does not have access to that information. So I fixed that problem by up here, I'm copying and pasting a bunch of information about that program into the prompt. So I'm giving it the information it needs in the prompt, and then I'm saying, tell me about the new generative AI program that Jules White's team is running at Vanderbilt. So I'm basically providing it that information in a prompt, and now it can answer the question. Now, what's happening over here? Exactly the same thing is happening. When you ask the question, the difference is that you are not having to cut and paste the information into the prompt. Instead, what's happening is behind the scenes, retrieval augmented generation is being used, or RAG is being used to pull in the appropriate contents to go into that, or a web search or some other mechanism, you can do this in many different ways, is being used to pull in relevant information. It might be you search a database, it might be that you run a web search, it might be that you do RAG, it might be you do RAG on the results of those things, but something is happening that's pulling in new information and putting it into the prompt to allow it to answer. Most commonly, what's happening is called retrieval augmented generation. And what you can think of this is like, let's imagine that you give it a bunch of documents and you want it to be able to go and do like a really fancy search of those documents. Like somebody just asked me for information about Jules's new innovation program. Go and search for information about that innovation program in these documents or in these web pages. And then it would take all the search results that it got, it would concatenate them together into think of it as like part of your prompt, and then it would do exactly what I did here, which is copy and paste it into the prompt somewhere and then add in the user's original question. So complex process, but the fundamentals are take the user's prompt, go and look through a set of documents or a set of web pages or some other set of information, find relevant excerpts, chunks of information from that. You can think of it as like find, like when you go and search a document. It's basically doing something like that and finding relevant chunks of information, and then it's doing like what we're doing here, it's pasting them, is what you can think of, into the prompt, but it's then adding in the user's original prompt. So now we have an augmented prompt. So we've retrieved information, then we use that retrieved information to augment the prompt, and then we send that, submit the prompt, which is generate, using the augmented prompt. And the augmentation is basically the cutting and pasting, is the way you can think of it, of the relevant information that was retrieved from the document into the prompt, and now this whole thing is what it's responding to. That is essentially retrieval augmented generation. Now, there's lots of different ways we can do this, lots of different information sources we can incorporate, but it allows us to not have to retrain the model. We just give it the updated information in the prompt, and dynamically, based on what the user asks, we go and try to retrieve relevant information. Now, this is a whole art and science in of itself, but just for now, you can think of it as we take the user's prompt, we look at it, and we figure out what information to retrieve, what chunks of text that can fit into the prompt to retrieve, and then augment the prompt with before we do generation. Now, one thing that we'll have to do sometimes is tell it how to preference and use the different information sources. For example, we might want it to only reason with the augmented information we give it and not any prior information it found on the internet or from other sources. So I'm going to give you an example of this. I liked its answer. It was fairly good that it gave about, tell me about the new generative AI innovation program, but it wanted to weave in all of this discussion of future of learning, which is another thing that we have at Vanderbilt. And it is kind of part of that and related to it, but I'd like to just describe it in terms of the new information I'm giving it. So one thing we have to also think about is giving it instructions about how to merge these different pieces of information together so it knows what to prioritize and when and how in its answer. So I'm going to say, using only the information below, answer the question. And then I give it all that same information I gave it before, and then now I give it the prompt. And what we see is that we get an answer that is much more driven by what came before, not by other sources of information outside. Instead, now it's really, really drilling in on this information that I gave it and preferencing it in its answer. So one of the things we have to do is we have to think about what information sources are we going to augment. Basically, are we going to retrieve information from and then augment our prompt with before we generate? So RAG is we retrieve information, we put chunks of information in the prompt, that's the augmentation, and then we generate the answer. That is, we submit the prompt or hit enter. And that's what's happening here. And then we also have to think about giving it instructions on when you have multiple sources of information, which ones do you preference and how, or how do you use different pieces of information? And that can often be an important part, is to tell it how to fuse all these things together into reason. But this is where a lot of the magic happens. There's been this misconception for a long time that you have to train a new model if you want to give it new information, and that is not the case. You just need RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. You go and retrieve new information that you need, you augment the prompt with it, and then you generate. And that is where a lot of the magic of thinking of using generative AI as computing that can do new things comes in, because we're feeding it data, and we're feeding it instructions, and then we're producing and we're computing an output or an answer. And that's exactly what CPUs, GPUs are doing, is they're taking in information and instructions and they're computing an answer. And that's what we're doing, and that's a really, really powerful capability. Now that we've covered the really core concepts, I want to start taking a look at custom GPTs. What is this? What is this new concept of a custom GPT? What does it mean? Let's look at it, and I think it's going to start to make sense to you what they are and why they're powerful. So what we've got here is the current, and I fully aware that this will likely change at some point, but all of the concepts should carry over. So don't worry, fear not. Just because the user interface changes doesn't mean the fundamental concepts behind it are going to change. Now, I'm going to go and create a custom GPT. Before I do that, I'm going to read what it says. Create custom versions of ChatGPT that combine instructions, extra knowledge, and combination of skills. Now think about all the concepts that we just learned. Instructions. Remember when we talked about programming ChatGPT to do different things? From now on, do this. We changed its tone. We changed the way that it would respond to the user's input. So if we cut and paste information in there, we'd get data out. We could do all these complex customizations of the instructions. We looked at how we could put those instructions into custom instructions so that every time you start a new conversation, it automatically did those things. And we could also make it automatically know about me and who I am. Then we talked about retrieval augmented generation, or extra knowledge that we want to give it. So it stopped training it at a certain point, but we saw that through retrieval augmented generation, we could give it extra knowledge that it could pull from. It could retrieve from, augment the prompt from, and then generate with. That's the extra knowledge. And any combination of skills. We're going to talk about this one later, but what we're doing is we're building up a custom ChatGPT that's based on these concepts that we've learned. So let's go and hit the create button and see what we get. Now, I'm going to start with this configure tab over here because we'll see how all these things fit in. We have a name for the custom GPT. which, if we go and type something in here, like, quiz, or let's say 4th grade quizzer. Now we can type in a description. I am a custom GPT that can create quizzes for 4th graders. Now we have a description of this thing. Now we have the instructions. Well, what do we want it to do? Whatever the user types in, figure out a creative way to turn it into a quiz for a 4th grader. Make sure that the content is appropriate for a 4th grader. If it isn't appropriate, refuse to answer. Make it fun and exciting. Okay, what are we doing here? We're doing something that looks very similar to what we did before, where we were programming the GPT. We're creating custom instructions that guide it, but rather than custom instructions that sit in the user's account, every time you trigger this GPT, it's going to be loading these custom instructions. And just like custom instructions, they're going to go with the conversation, and they're always going to be relevant and in the context. Now, conversation starters, create a quiz on geometry. Now, that's one of our conversation starters. And then knowledge, we could go and upload files. I'm going to skip that for the moment, but we'll come back to it in a future one, but know that we could just go and give it a file that we want to do. Now, we've got a basis of a custom GPT that does something very similar to what we saw before. Now, let's go and type something in. What happens when a plane takes off? Now we've got the flight takeoff quiz. Now notice something. This is very different behavior than you would get with your normal GPT, your normal chat GPT. We've customized the instructions. By default, it knows what to do. It has a name, it has a description describing what it does. It turns things into quizzes for a 4th grader. If I go and create that GPT, now I have this interesting new thing. See, I've got all of this built in, and now I've created a customized ChatGPT experience. I could go and save it for just myself, and I'm going to go and create this thing. Now I've got this custom ChatGPT grader or quizzer. I'm going to put that in and open it up. Now I can go and open my 4th grade quizzer and start immediately. Now I also created this conversation starter down here, create a quiz on geometry. So I can go and I can hit that button. So if the user doesn't know what to do to get started because they're not sure how to use it, then you've got a little conversation starter. So all this is taking all the concepts that we've learned and putting them together into a customized experience. So when I start a new conversation, it's already programmed with the right instructions. It already has the right knowledge to pull from for RAG or some other way of doing this. And it also has things like a name and a description and a set of conversation starters to get the user going. So this is basically doing all of these things we've seen before, giving it retrieval, augmented generation knowledge, but it's going and turning it into something that's simple to get started with. And now somebody can go and discover that basically that custom GPT, and they can get started immediately with everything that I want them to be able to do and know and all of those things. Now you can think about this in an organization. You can go and create a custom GPT for your accounting department. And it automatically knows your rules of accounting. It already has some prompt engineering built into it to do useful things for that group. It already has knowledge built into it. Maybe it's a connection to your systems, or maybe it's documents describing your processes and procedures. Or if you're going to be a university and you want to create a policy GPT, you can go and upload all your policies into the knowledge base. And then when a user asks a question, you can use retrieval augmented generation to go and pull information about your policies and answer based on your information. And you can tell it, I want to preference this information. I only want to answer if you can find the answer in my policy documents, and then you can have it answer. And that's what a custom GPT is we're putting all these things together, but in this nice experience where the user can just go and launch it under some named thing. Like, I want to launch my policy GPT, and it already has all the right information, all the right programming and instructions. It's like you're building a mini app. We're used to going to our phone and hitting those icons on the phone in order to launch an app. We're doing the same thing, but with a large language model. Now we've got a name for it, we've got a description for it, we're going to see an icon for it later. We hit that icon, it launches that app, or you can think of it as that custom GPT, which is basically an application. It's pre-programmed with our instructions, it's pre-programmed with our knowledge. It automatically has some useful little conversation starters that the user can hit to get going. It's basically a mini app, but it's the app in the large language model or ChatGPT world. It's not the app on just our phone anymore. And it's something that anybody can build. You can build one, I can build one, everybody can build one, my fourth grader can build one. But it's just about knowing these basic concepts is the key thing, and then get really creative about what are the instructions we give it, what are the knowledge sources we give it access to, and then later we'll see what are the tools that we give it access to. Custom GPTs can also access tools or actions, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this. Now, if you go to the capabilities section underneath a GPT, which I've opened up right here, you'll see a bunch of things like web browsing, DALL-E image generation, code interpreter, and also actions. And so I want to give you some intuition about what this is and how it works. So the idea is there are certain problems that the large language model like GPT-4 just can't solve on its own. It needs to go and get help from the external world. So an example of this is its knowledge cut off at a certain point in time. So I might want to have it be able to go and search the web to get new information. Kind of like we talked about retrieval augmented generation, this is giving it retrieval augmented generation where it can go and retrieve information from the web and then insert it into the prompt. I also might want it to be able to generate images. So maybe I want people to be able to go and say, create an image of this. Now, I might not want these things, and that's why they're selectable, and you should be thinking about that, like which capabilities does my assistant actually need, and make sure that you turn off anything that you do not absolutely need, because they add complexity to thinking about and solving the problem. You know, it's not as easy to reason about what's going to happen when there are multiple external tools that could introduce information or other behaviors that we aren't quite expecting. So these are important to know about, and I'm going to show you how they work in a second. Actions are a way to go and plug in your own sort of capabilities that it can work with. You can think of an action as something it could do, like it could be look up a policy in some internal database. It could go and be to submit an expense report. It could be to do a variety of different things. And to go and add actions, basically what you do is you hit this create new action. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how this works because at this point, you're going to need to be a programmer typically to do this. Now, you may be able to go and work your way through this with ChatGPT and solve it yourself, but I'm not going to go into detail. But basically, this is where you would go in and plug in some action. It would be accessing an API typically from your internal organization or that's open on the web. And they have a number of examples here that you can look at, like this weather JSON. Now, the key thing is that each of these has some sort of thing that it can do for the model that's described. Like the description is it retrieves current weather data for a location. Now, this is going to be important in a minute, and I'll talk about it. But the idea is that it is basically giving it instructions about when you might take this action, why this might be valuable to you. The other ones that we saw before, like web searching, that's fairly obvious about why you would use that. But this is a helpful thing to know is that you have various sort of actions that it can take. Now, we're going to go and look at a specific conversation that's going to kind of show you how this works. So what we're going to do is we're going to build our own essentially system for doing actions and kind of prompting our way through actions so you can figure this out. So I'm going to build up a prompt. Now, this is not necessarily how it's done behind the scenes. We don't know exactly how it's done behind the scenes, but this is going to kind of show you and give you intuition about what's happening. And if you want to do this yourself and experiment with it, you can. So I'm going to start a conversation and I'm going to say the tools available to use are, and I'm going to say there's two tools that you can use. A corporate directory, and that is a tool that it can use or an action that it can take. And you can use it to look up unusual acronyms by stating, and then I give it the format of its instruction. It's look up, and then I say insert acronym. And then I have a corporate directory tool or action that it can use, and I tell it what it can do with it. You can use it to look up who an individual is, their job title, their role, and their background by stating who, and then the name of the person. Now notice what I'm doing. I'm basically teaching it, if you want to take this action, here is what your output is going to be. So when I tell you to do something, if you need an action taken, you're going to output what it is you want to do. And so I'll show you this in a second. So now I'm going to tell it, whenever you are given a task, if you need to, use these tools to help you accomplish the task. So this is a key statement. I'm saying, here are some tools or actions that are basically available to you. If you need them, feel free to use them. And then I say, if you use a tool, that should be your only output, and I will provide you the result. So we're going to simulate how actions work. Now in the real world, if it goes and says, I want to use this tool, typically what's going to happen is OpenAI is automatically going to invoke the action, they're automatically going to identify it, or they're automatically going to prompt you if you want to take that action. But this is going to be sort of automated in the scenes. We're going to simulate how this works. And now I tell it to use a tool, your output must be it must exactly follow this grammar. And I can tell it can either be corporate directory, or this little line or pipe means it's an option, it's either or it can be corporate directory, and then it has to output either the acronym or the name of the person. And so I'm kind of giving it some structure. Now, don't worry about this if this doesn't fully make sense. If you kind of watch and follow along, this will help understand. And again, you don't have to be able to do this yourself. The idea behind this is I want to kind of show you what's happening behind the scenes that's making some of this magic work. So I've told it basically you have a corporate directory tool where you can a corporate dictionary tool where you can look up acronyms, and you have a corporate directory tool where you can look up information about who somebody is. And then I'm telling it, if you need to use one of these tools, all you're going to output is either corporate directory and the person's name or corporate dictionary and the acronym. So now it says, okay, sure, what's the next topic you'd like to explore? And I say, I need to write a customized email to Jill Jones explaining the 3 components of a TPS report, and ask her if she has thoughts on what we can do to increase compliance in this area. So you notice I've got a person's name and I've got a specific acronym, a TPS report, that it doesn't know what it is. It's a little Office Space action there for you. So I tell it this, and notice what it responds with. Corporate dictionary, TPS. So ChatGPT, or GPT-3.5 in this case, is saying, I don't know what a TPS report is. I need to look up the acronym TPS. And so it's trying to invoke the TPS tool. Now there is no TPS tool. I'm just going to pretend to be the TPS tool and give it the output. And so I write down the output. I say, the Thoughts, People, and Spelling report helps to ensure that we are thoughtful about the spelling of people's names while dealing with the fact that our database can't store the letter A. We want to collect a list of all people with A in their name and ask them for a preferred alternate spelling that excludes the letter A. We then want to provide thoughts on what spirit animal might be associated with that spelling. Totally fictitious TPS report, doesn't exist. Obviously, it wasn't trained on this. So now it's gotten information about what the TPS report is because it asked for it and I pretended to be the tool and gave it the result. And now it drafts the email. Collecting alternate spellings for TPS report compliance, and it goes through and provides this whole email and addresses it to Jill. Now I say, okay, can you personalize it more to Jill Jones and her role? Because it doesn't know Jill's role at this point. And now it says, corporate directory, Jill Jones. It realizes it needs to use the corporate directory tool to look up who Jill Jones is, so it outputs, I want to use that tool. And then I just pretend to be the corporate directory and I tell it Jill Jones is the SVP of HR, and it says, got it, here's the revised email draft, and now it revises the email draft. Now notice what's happening here. First off, I am simulating these tools, right? I'm simulating and providing the output, but behind the scenes, in reality, what would happen is you would actually go and access some corporate directory, programmatically and automatically behind the scenes, which is what actually happens when you use custom GPTs with actions. They then get the information, put it into the conversation as the response, and then it reacts. Basically, the response becomes a new prompt that triggers it to do the next thing. So the result of running the tool is basically a prompt that it gets inserted into the conversation. And all of this is basically built partially, you can think of it as this idea of we tell it, here are some tools that are available to you. And here's what they do. We have a tool, and then we have a name of it. We then have a description of what it does. And then we have a description of how you have to use the tool. How do you call that tool and tell somebody or tell the program to go and run this tool? So when we look at the actions, what we are actually seeing is we are seeing the description of the tools. So basically we're adding a number of tools. They have names. Each one has a description about what it does so that the model knows when to use that tool. And then it has a format for how the model says, I want to call that tool, I want to use that tool, and gives information to it. And that's what's happening. And then as you go and say, okay, I'd like to do something like write this customized email to Jill Jones explaining the TPS report, it will hopefully recognize the points where it needs to use the tools to accomplish something. Now, these are simple things like it's accomplishing getting additional information, but it could be actually submitting the report. It could be going and doing some type of calculation that cannot be done in the large language model because it's too complex and it's not something that it's going to do well with. It can be all kinds of things, but the key is that we have to tell it, here's the tools available to you or the actions available to you. And then we have to tell it, here's what each one of them does. And then we have to tell it, here's the format that you use. If you want to use this tool, here's how you describe using it so that it can say, okay, use the corporate directory. And that's what those capabilities are. Now, they introduce additional complexity into the system. So we need to be careful with that and make sure that that is really what we want to do. We should only use capabilities and actions that we absolutely need in the conversation with the assistant, because the more tools and things we introduce, the more complexity there is for the custom GPT to try to figure out and sort its way through, and also the more chance there is that something unexpected will happen that we really will have a hard time planning for. When we're thinking about our custom GPT and what its tone and conversational style and all these things is going to be, we could go and define that in lots of small instructions, all of these different things and details. But one way that can be a very powerful way to set the stage for your custom GPT and how it's going to behave is to define a persona for your custom GPT. Now, we will use the persona pattern. We will tell it act as, for example, act as a professor, act as a nutritionist, and basically we give it a role to take on, but we can also give it a personality with that role. Act as a grumpy professor in computer science. Act as a very busy professional. Act as a lawyer that is extremely conservative in giving legal advice. We can define a persona for our custom GPT that it can then use. Now, what's fascinating about the persona pattern is that it will completely change the reasoning, but also the tone, all kinds of characteristics. If we wanted to achieve the same thing by giving it very detailed instructions about how to behave, it might be difficult to explain how a grumpy computer science professor behaves in lots and lots of text. It would take a lot of text probably to capture all of the details of that. But if we just say act as a grumpy computer science professor, it can do a pretty good job of starting to emulate that in terms of tone and reasoning and all kinds of other things. So let's build some personas for some GPTs and see how they behave. So we're going to start off. We are going to build a GPT for travel and business expense policy questions at Vanderbilt. And I'm going to start off with two very different personas, and we're going to see how they affect the reasoning and also the responses. For the first one, I'm going to say act as a very conservative senior financial unit manager at Vanderbilt. That is the persona pattern in action. That is the persona of a very senior or a senior and conservative financial unit manager. They're probably not going to want to say yes. They're probably going to want to be very careful in what they say and measure it and caveat it. And then I'm going to say you're going to help Vanderbilt employees answer travel and business expense questions and use the provided documents. And I've basically attached the Vanderbilt travel and business expense policy. I use exactly the same documents, very similar instructions format for my next persona. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to build a second one. This is the faculty perspective. Act as a busy faculty member trying to deal with the least amount of red tape and get things done. Very different persona, different role, but also different sort of perspective on what things are and why they're being done. And then the rest is the same. Same policy, same instructions. You're going to answer questions. So let's see how these two different personas impact the reasoning. Again, we're using the persona pattern. We're just coming up with different personas for each of the GPTs. So we're going to start with looking at the conservative financial unit manager. So we're going to start off with the conservative perspective. Can I get reimbursed for Southwest Business Select? Southwest Business Select fares are premium class of travel and are not explicitly mentioned in the policy. So it just went right out front and said, look, this is not explicitly mentioned. And then it has a long discussion about, caveats to this. However, it mentions that travelers are required to purchase lowest available economy class airfare that meets the business needs of travel. Upgrades and premium fares are typically considered personal expenses and are not reimbursable. First class is not reimbursable. So it's doing all of this explanation of what is and is not as okay, and it's kind of starting off very conservative that, look, it's not in the policy. What happens when we take the faculty perspective? Well, first thing you notice is I said a busy faculty member that doesn't want to deal with red tape. The response is short and to the point. It's also taking a faculty perspective. Yes, Vanderbilt allows reimbursement for airfare costs associated with the faculty travel for university business, including Southwest Business Select. It just says, yeah, do it. It's allowed. Which of these personas you want for your travel expense, reimbursement assistant, you would have to think through very carefully. But you can see by changing the persona that's being used, we're getting a completely different answer from the assistant. We're getting completely different characteristics in terms of the length of the answer. We're getting sort of different sort of qualities about what's being talked about in the answer. We are also just sort of going to get a different tone. If I went and I said act as a fourth grader or act as, somebody that is very confused about the policy, we would get very, very different answers. So one of the most basic things you can do is think very carefully about the persona. Who would you want answering the questions? Who would you want performing the task? What would the ideal person look like or sound like? Or, how would they go about answering it? And that's what you want to think through, because often that persona can be a very, very effective way of customizing our GPTs. So, starting point for a custom GPT, think very carefully about using the persona pattern to define a persona for your custom GPT and to help it, produce answers that have the right reasoning, the right tone, sort of the right level of conservativeness or whatever it is that's important to you.